Wow. Yeah. Feeling it. Oh, that was a very short-lived dip, Stacy.
That's right. And you know what? I'm going to teach you some sign language. Here are lessons from Bitcoin Meme Hub. Have. This is have.
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 Fun. F.
Fun.
S. Poor. Like this.
Poor.
Yep. Poor.
Poor.
So have fun saying poor. That's a good lesson for all of those people who were, like in the mainstream media, saying that the Bitcoin dream is dead, that Bitcoin is in a bear market, CNN called it, for 3 days. And a special have fun saying poor for Max's favorite, and everybody's hoping that they get a Christine Lagarde.
Oh, Christine Lagarde! Oui! Je m'appelle Christine Lagarde. Je suis français. Et j'aime bien imprimer de l'argent. Imprimer de l'argent, j'aime bien. J'imprime. Et quand j'imprime l'argent pour le monde, j'ai expérience un petit orgasme. Exactement. Je vais jette. Oh, jette, Christine, jette. Le sens de mon forme est formidable. Oh.
Right. Christine Lagarde had H, F, S, P. Okay. H, F, S, P. So she should have fun saying poor. The audacity of her, in case you don't know, she's the head of the European Central Bank. And she said that Bitcoin there's funny business going on over there, which I'm going to bring up in our interview with Nic Carter, because it's quite interesting. He's been focusing on all these deplatformings going on and the censorship resistance of Bitcoin. And when she says funny business, the first thing I thought of was the fact that comedians were the first to start being deplatformed or attacked online for their jokes, which were not, social justice warrior acceptable. And, of course, Bitcoin is the place that will eventually, the second layers and third layers and all these auction houses and Sphinx chat sort of developments haven't yet been fully developed. But one day this will be the safe space for censorship resistance speech.
Right. It's remarkable. So she comes out and not only saying that Bitcoin is, funny business, which is a very weak attempt to describe what's going on with Bitcoin. So she's clearly very, very, very late into kind of figuring out what's going on here. But she says we need to bring in global regulation, right? So this is really egomaniacal poppycock. This French woman who runs the ECB, which is a dying institution in itself. And I believe I've predicted already on another show that the ECB will be the first major global central bank to go bust in 2021. They will recapitalize it and they won't call it a bust. They'll call it something different, like a reset, but it'll go bust. That she has the gall, to use a French word, to suggest that she's going to impose global regulation. And of course, what's happening in other countries that are outside the influence of these bureaucrats and nincompoops is that they're madly buying and mining Bitcoin because they realize that these bureaucrats and central bankers have gone way, way, way round the bend, and they need to protect themselves now. So, this is, on one hand, it's disgusting and appalling, but on the other hand, it's great because the Bitcoin attracts these critics and foes, And we're moving up the global ladder, right? It used to be with that it was against like tech guys were fighting tech guys, and then tech guys were fighting bankers, and then money managers were fighting bankers. And we had Peter Schiff, he got into the ring and he started boxing against Bitcoin, and he's been losing every round for 10 years. And then we got Nouriel Roubini and Paul Krugman. Okay, they're kind of regional, they're US based. But now we got the global characters, right? Like Christine Lagarde. There's only a few people after Christine Lagarde until its game is completely and entirely over. She's kind of like one of the last pins to drop.
I also wanted to say, as we're at the top of the show right now, this episode is brought to you by swanbitcoin.com/Stacy. Yes, you can see that in our wide shot over here. The swan is sitting there taking care of all. We've been smash buying. We got to smash buy. I smash bought quite a lot when it was fell below 40,000, and CNN was shouting that it was a bear market. And I think it was the New York Times said the Bitcoin dream is over. So I was smash buying then. And of course, for any of the newbies in the Orange Pill Podcast Telegram group, it's quite, your first huge drop in Bitcoin, and it was down something like 28% at its low. It's quite unnerving, but that's what the Orange Pill Podcast Telegram group is for, is to, there's a lot of people in there who have already endured like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 of these spectacular drops.
C'est vrai, Swan. Et est-ce que tu parles comme ça un petit peu? Oui, je m'appelle Swanee. Et Christine Lagarde est con. Elle est con.
Okay.
What? Swanee, that's rude. Don't say that about Christine. I'm putting you back away.
So I also want to point out regarding Christine Lagarde, who used the public airwaves in order to say that Bitcoin has a lot of funny business going on. And she in particular said that, I think she used kind of a word that it was reprehensible. She said Bitcoin is reprehensible and it allows money laundering. So Christine Lagarde is the head of the ECB. Just understand that she is a regulator for European banks. So I want to show you a headline from this week alone about a European bank. In fact, the largest of European banks. Well, I mean, it's crashed so much, I don't know if it's still the largest, but Deutsche Bank agrees to pay $130 million in latest major U.S. penalty to resolve an investigation into a foreign bribery scheme. The German lender entered a deferred prosecution agreement, a common way for big banks to avoid criminal charges. Of course, Bitcoiners are not allowed to avoid criminal charges. We had Charlie Shrem go to prison. We had Ross Ulbricht sentenced to 2.5 lifetimes in prison. So, here we have these people, these banks under the supervision of Christine Lagarde are bribing foreign officials. If you try to do that, whether you use euros, dollars, or Bitcoin, you will go to prison for several lifetimes. If you get caught in America, maybe in Europe, you might get 7 years. But the fact is that here she is pointing fingers, and yet, she's casting the first stone, literally. Like, she's the one that should be looking at herself.
Yeah, this is, remarkable, right? So the European banks and banks around the world, as Max and Stacy have been covering now for 15 years. If you look at all of our media and content going back 15 years ago, we coined the phrase global insurrection against banker occupation. We said that Occupy Wall Street was a part of that movement, and every subsequent social movement has essentially been against banks. And that has been borne out now with all of the criticism being thrown at the central banks, and in particular, the European central banks, and in particular, the European Central Bank, which, remember, during the Greek collapse was part of the Troika. And the Troika engaged in what I would call financial terrorism. And that's been borne out as well, in that we see banks like HSBC actually fund the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico and engaged in all kinds of money laundering and terrorist activities to the tune of $300 billion in fines have been paid by these banks in the last 10 years. Now, if you look at Bitcoin's participation in illicit activities, I saw a study recently, less than 1%. Bitcoin is particularly poor if you want to commit crimes, because the blockchain is completely transparent and available to everyone to look at. And everyone who tries to do criminal activity with Bitcoin usually gets caught. Unlike paper money, when you have no accountability at all, plus no enforcement of any regulations by regulators like Christine Lagarde at all. Okay, this woman is, thank God, enemy number one, because I can do my bad French accent I can do my bad French now for the next year. 2021 is the year of Max Keiser doing bad French to criticize and mock Christine Lagarde, and I'm happy about it.
I might add that that is one of the flaws of Bitcoin, is that it is very transparent. So there are measures in the works now, developments happening like Taproot and Schnorr and all of that stuff to make it more anonymous and the ability to retain your privacy while you're transacting around the world. But then again, I also want to go to, this financial, the attempts at financial censorship are in the news this past week. And I want to remind people of something that is relevant to this discussion about censorship. And that's the Magna Carta, just in case people have forgotten what that is all about, because that really set in motion all of the Enlightenment ideas that followed a couple hundred years later. The Magna Carta was a royal charter of rights agreed to by King John of England at Runnymede near Windsor on 15th of June, 1215. The Magna Carta, it is said, is the greatest constitutional document of all times, the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. And that's really important, the arbitrary. So the fact that the despot could suddenly just conjure up a law and say you broke it, like because you happen to walk, with your left foot first going off the curb, the despot might decide, I'm going to make that illegal. So when we look at Twitter and we look at the deplatforming happening across AWS or Stripe deplatforming the president, or all these three banks that have deplatformed him, this is the arbitrary nature of the authority, the terms of services that they're applying to these people. They're saying, Jack Dorsey of Twitter wrote a long thread explaining why they had to deplatform President Trump. And one of the things that you notice is the arbitrariness of it, the arbitrary nature of the fact of who these despotic powers that are emerging. Right now, it's in the Democratic Party. We've already covered that it used to be kind of like the Republican Party back in the 50s, 60s, 70s that had more of this sort of power. But now these people in cultural power are indeed using this arbitrary, capricious nature of a despot, where they get to determine, say, for example, the arbitrary nature of the Black Lives Matters protests across the summer and burning down government buildings in Portland and Minneapolis and places like that, or police stations. Okay. I believe in the rights of the people to protest, and so did CNN. So did most of the news media. But now, like when people went to Capitol Hill and protested, the majority of them did not storm the Capitol and, invade the private property and steal stuff. But they want to say, if you went to that, that is illegal. That sort of protest is illegal. Even if it was a dumb protest, it was legal prior to arbitrary declarations of what is legal and illegal.
Right. I mean, this is a brilliant kind of look back over the past 800 years and where the rights that we enjoy came from. Yeah, the Magna Carta, the 13th century, let's call it. 1215. Which is, this word arbitrary is a key phrase, right? So you're separating state from the monarchy, right? Then we had separation of state from church, and then we had separation of money from state, but this was the key separation of the people or the state from monarchy. And it was the beginning of the end of the medieval kind of abuses that went on to some degree. Of course, and it didn't happen until the Renaissance that we had a true blossoming out of the monarchical tyranny. But this arbitrary
and the Enlightenment,
and then this word arbitrary and arbitrary rulemaking and arbitrary enforcement. I mean, this is exactly what we're up against right now. So the rule makers in big tech, and they're in bed with government. I think government is the tail of big tech, the dog, right? So big tech is waving the tail of government, but it's not really in the ruling elite is not the government, it's big tech. And they are making arbitrary rules that are overturning norms that have been with us since the Magna Carta, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and all documents suggesting that humans have natural rights. And so this is, it is arbitrary, dictatorial, tyranny. I guess it's tyranny.
It's despotism.
Despotism.
As it was called in the Magna Carta. And prior to the Magna Carta as well, we had habeas corpus introduced in the United Kingdom. And it was due to the same sort of issues. The king had so much absolute power, but who he upset were the lords, right? Like the aristocrats. He was randomly, arbitrarily detaining and arresting and basically taking their wealth. And so, I mean, that's part of what you're seeing now is an absence of habeas corpus, for example. So a lot of people in the Bitcoin space are libertarians and they say, well, these are private companies. So, okay, so our senators like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, they say they want them on a no-fly list. So they can't use our airlines in our public airspace with the public grants them a license to fly in our airspace because they have to prove that they're safe and airworthy, for example, and their pilots are actually trained, unlike, say, Pakistan Air, which was apparently using untrained pilots recently. So, this absence of habeas corpus, obviously Trump said a speech and some in Congress are saying it was illegal. It was an incitement to violence, but, that hasn't been tried in a court of law. And yet all these banks deplatformed him, including Deutsche Bank, who is here bribing foreign officials, by the way. And then you have the AWS deplatforming, Twitter deplatforming, no right of to challenge why, the thing about Magna Carta and habeas corpus was like, you were supposed to be told why you're being arrested, why you're in prison. You should have the right to go in front of a judge and a jury and explain yourself, and that the person incarcerating you has to, more importantly, say why you deserve or what violations you committed, what crimes you committed to warrant this arrest.
Right. It's arbitrary despotism. Now this argument about private companies, all arguments and all conceits and all concepts and all legal discussions make certain concessions, and there's a lot of nuance, and nothing is completely, utterly, indefatigably on the side of pure righteousness. I mean, this is the law. It takes time and it's still evolving. And one basic tenet of the law that's been with us now for hundreds of years is the social contract. And that took us out of really the Middle Ages, through the Enlightenment, through John Locke's work on the social contract, into more of a modern society that we live in today, where there's a balance of power that's shared from the government and the people. Let's put it in those terms. This argument that these social networking companies are private, therefore do not need to conform to what I would call the mandate of a basic social contract, is tyranny, right? Or despotism, if you want to call it despotism. So this is the beginning of a split in society that is going to now play out, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And we've seen splits like this happen in societies before. In America, we had one in the 19th century that resulted in a civil war, and that was brutal, and it changed America forever in many, many different ways. I think we're on the cusp now of a similar type of split in society because of these arbitrary despotism that has taken hold once again. And essentially, America right now is up for grabs. So we have to take that on board and say, okay, America is no longer a functioning government. The government's out to lunch. It's not happening. There's nobody ruling the country. There's nobody ruling the central bank. And there's nobody in charge at this point. It's just a wide open field. So now it's a race to see who's going to win. Is it going to be a reassertion of the powers of the social contract, the people worked out for hundreds of years, or is this the end? Right now at this moment, I mean, I see Bitcoin playing a huge role in reclaiming our rights, but it's going to be touch and go. It's not a foregone conclusion.
Well, I believe Bitcoin will restore our rights. If you want it, you can grab it. You can be orange pill yourself. I believe also that it's quite profound to witness the desire, the right to assemble is part of the First Amendment. So the freedom of the people they have the right to assemble. And in this digital age, especially during lockdown, mandatory lockdowns, the people want to assemble. They want to communicate with each other. And that's why we have the Telegram group. But you saw when Twitter deplatformed the president and people were not allowed to speak to the president any longer. They were not allowed to communicate with the president or hear his words. You saw 20 million people join Signal and Telegram in the course of 48 hours. So you're starting to see alternatives. BitcoinHackers.org is a Mastodon instance run by somebody in the Bitcoin community. Anybody could start their own instance if they don't want to, if they upset the person running Bitcoin Hackers, that they have a right to kick you off, but you have a right always to load your own instance. And I want to say two more things before we throw to Nic Carter is that I saw a great word for what's going on, and that's called, that term of disaster capitalism? Well, what the left is doing is disaster liberalism. So you see them imposing, using a crisis, like some people who stormed the Capitol. So now they want to introduce these no-fly lists. They want to expand the powers of the FBI to start observing and watching and following right-wing people. If you have the wrong think, they say that they should be able to follow you. But this tweet from Matt Odell is a great way to lead into our interview with Nic Carter. And Matt Odell said, "The most powerful man in the world can be banned from social media, but the least powerful person in the world cannot be banned from Bitcoin." What do you think of that, Max?
Have fun staying poor. That's why I just meant, no, that's not right. I think I just said something nasty in sign language. Uh-oh. Something
that was
about
very rude.
Christine Lagarde's private parts. Anyway, we're going to go to Nic Carter.
And this interview was brought to you by swanbitcoin.com/Max. Make sure you start smashing those Bitcoins, start stacking straight away there. You could dollar cost average, or you could smash buy. Okay, time now to go to Nic Carter.
Wow, yeah. Okay, this is exciting. Let's go to Nic Carter. And according to his Twitter bio, he is a serf on Jack's feudal estate. Of course, Nic Carter is well known in the Bitcoin community. He's been tweeting and writing and talking and being at conferences for years and years. He's kind of like one of the big heads, as they say in Europe. A big head in France is somebody who is a big thinker and an excellent writer. So, Nic, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Max and Stacy. It's my pleasure to be here.
Hey, we've been following you on this whole Twitter thing because basically we've crossed the Rubicon in the past week or two, and Twitter deplatformed the president of the United States and 70,000 of the 90 million followers he had. Now, many argue that Twitter is a private company, and so it has a right to do what it wants to. Your response to that argument, Nic?
Yeah, so I mean, in a strict kind of legalistic sense, yes, they do have the right. They reserve the right to deplatform pretty much anyone for pretty much any reason. I mean, their terms of service are very vague, so it's kind of opaque, but really up to them, who they provide services to. So that argument, I would say, is correct in a very narrow sense, but there's a lot more considerations there. One can certainly question the independence of these large sort of internet oligopolies. For instance, Twitter, we know, was infiltrated by Saudi intelligence agents. That's public knowledge. That was a news story a couple of years ago, and they used their platform within the organization to target Saudi dissidents. So, were they a private company when they were carrying out duties on behalf of the Saudi regime? I don't think so. I think they were acting for the state. Now, that's just one incident, but now imagine if Twitter's goals were deputized by, let's say, the US government. Let's say there's a lot of rotation between Twitter executives and the coming administration. That's not too far-fetched. So I think there's a blurring of lines between private and public that kind of makes it a little more complicated. If we have private firms that are just doing the outsourced duty of the state in terms of censorship, that seems like an end around the First Amendment, but does it make that censorship any less worse if it's being done by a private company as opposed to the state itself? I don't think so.
I want to also point out that there was something that I noticed and Max and I noticed, and we were following and tweeting about it. All those tweets have disappeared. I don't know how. But the day Michael Jackson died, he never trended #1 topic. Do you know why? Do you know what the people, the good people, the really politically correct people of Twitter were more concerned about? Hashtag Green Revolution. Apparently the revolution, allegedly, you know, whatever happened, I don't know. And I don't care about that right now for this particular conversation. What I'm saying is that even Michael Jackson dying did not preempt the Iranian Green Revolution happening. And at that time, there used to be a website whereby you could enter 2 hashtags and compare the live stream of like the live tweets going on. And Michael Jackson versus Green Revolution. Green Revolution went like this. Dun, dun. And it was the same exact tweet over and over by different accounts. Michael Jackson one was like, his death almost took down the whole global internet. And yet he never trended. So you have to ask who decided that? Who was Twitter working for at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a secret that literally all of these internet platforms exercise extreme discretion in terms of what is allowed to trend and what is not. That's not even a conspiracy. We know this for a fact. We know that Twitter has these internal controls and these internal filters. We know that if you compare Google search on Google and DuckDuckGo, you're going to get totally different results. If you know, for certain innocuous concepts, there's blacklisting, there's kind of gray listing, there's downranking, like they see it as their mandate, all of these internet platforms, to control the way that we get information, to control what information is allowed to exist. It's, you know, it's as simple as that.
Right. Well, we also see in the financial markets where there's a suppression of gold because the central bankers believe that people need to believe in the fiat money and not pay any attention to gold. But I wanted to turn to one of your tweets here that you just put up. So you said these firms, talking about social media firms like Twitter, are extensions of the state rather than, quote, private companies. Exporting these attitudes is a form of imperialism. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. First of all, on the topic of, again, getting back to private companies and are they private companies, and is it enough to say simply, well, we're private companies? I would posit the answer is no, but you brilliantly get into this a little bit deeper. But it kind of goes back, Nick, to the whole notion of the social contract. You know, it's a private company, sure, but the individuals in our country have certain inalienable rights in terms of being able, the right to assemble, the right to have free speech, etc. That's part of the social contract. If Twitter is going to break the social contract, I go back to John Locke, who was one of the biggest proponents of the social contract back in the 1700s. He said, if the social contract is broken, the people have a right to form militias, to give the exact quote of John Locke. So, yeah. I mean, is that too much of a stretch there that I'm going down that path? Or am I making an interesting point here that it's not really a question of whether they're private companies really at this point? It's a question of whether they're violating the social contract in as a whole, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's so many examples you can find of companies that look like governments and governments that look like companies. I don't see a bright line between the two of them at all. I mean, the East India Company, private company, but they had a military, right? They suppressed the Sepoy rebellion in India. They were a large military force. Now you could say they were an extension of the British government. That's kind of making my point here. You have, like, what is a government? A government is an entity that governs. That's it, right? What does Facebook do? They control the digital lives, footprint, ability to communicate with 4 billion people globally. They govern, of course. They will meddle in elections, right? They were just shut out of Uganda because Uganda thought they were interfering in the election. So they're making political decisions. They are governing. I see them as governments. They're sovereign in their own right. We live online more than we live in meat space now. So these firms, to me, are effectively governments. So, at the scale that they have achieved and their ability to algorithmically influence the content of these platforms, I see them as governments of a sort and their own jurisdictions with their own legal systems. The terms of service, that's a legal system. So, I don't drive much of a distinction between a government and a, internet fiefdom. I mean, think about, go back 200 years, someone living in Massachusetts, their local administrator that was most relevant to them was maybe not even the US government, it was probably the state, right? So we always have different levels of administrative unit that are most relevant to us. And my question would be, what administrative entity is more consequential to my life today? It's probably a social media network, because that is where I have commercial value. That's where I ply my trade. That is where I exist for the most part. Of course, I also exist in meat space. I'm accountable to the US government, et cetera. But I'm also accountable to this parallel government. Facebook, I mean, I'm not on Facebook, but Twitter, Google, Amazon, I depend on all these things. And they believe that they have the ability to control my speech and how I do business and all of that. So I see them as effectively the same class of entity. And I think we need to start thinking about these internet platforms as actual jurisdictions in their own right that are governed by, mostly unaccountable bureaucrats.
I also want to point out that what happened to Donald Trump when he got deplatformed is he also got cut off from banking services. His website lost Stripe. 3 different banks cut him off from financial services. A lot of his followers jumped over to Parler, which was, another social media platform, which prided itself on free speech, right? So once that happened, however, Apple Store and Google Play dropped their app, and then AWS blocked them from the internet, removed their hosting services. AWS, of course, also has a large contract with the CIA. So, I mean, these are coordinated attacks. We saw this happen to WikiLeaks. Then it was like supposedly a one-off because he's a terrorist and, committed treason against America, even though he's Australian, whatever. But then it happened to Alex Jones, and now it's President Trump and 70,000 of his followers. And we're seeing this like snowball effect of, you look at all those people who ally with the anti-Trump sort of, like, it feels good to them to see Trump deplatformed, and they're calling on further and further people to get the same treatment. So what do you think of that? Like, being cut off from financial services seems like the next step is what? Utilities, your telephone, like what happens?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I love how people can't see more than one step ahead here. Obviously, it feels great when your political opponents get effectively ghosted and shut out of all internet society. Must feel great, However, it's so impudent and arrogant to think that could never be turned around and happen to you. So, I don't know if that small, short-term feeling of euphoria is worth surrendering all civil liberties over. And the financial services angle is particularly insidious, right? This is why we do Bitcoin, right? This is why Bitcoin exists in the first place. So at least we've begun working on the tools to prevent this. But it's been the policy of the state to influence who can do business through the banks. And the banks are not private companies. They're like public-private partnerships. They rely on charters. So they kind of exist at the behest of the state. It's been the policy of the US government to influence who can do businesses by weaponizing the banks via payment processors against certain industries. This is completely public information on the record. Operation Choke Point was the most infamous version, but my view is that has continued since it was ostensibly closed in 2015. Effectively, what we had was the DOJ, certain activists at the DOJ used the FDIC and said, hey, banks can't do businesses with payment processors that do business with these industries: firearms, fireworks, adult industries, payday lending, and a bunch of other stuff. And the payment processors complied because they didn't want to be seen as high risk, and the banks complied because they didn't want subpoenas from the DOJ or investigation from the FDIC. So it's already been policy in this country to influence who is allowed to do business through the banking sector, which again is like semi-public, semi-private. It's not private. We don't have free banks, right? So this isn't new, but it's very concerning that it's accelerating at this pace. The fact that payment processors are again being deputized for political objectives, it's only going to get worse, of course. And we're going to enter this sort of bifurcated world where if you have politically acceptable opinions, you're allowed to use banks and Stripe and PayPal, and the rest of us, if you're a Bitcoiner, I'm sure, we'll eventually all be shut off. The rest of us will have to use, gray market or parallel services that are much less mature. So that's where I see this going.
Right. Let's go back to the year 1215, the creation of the Magna Carta, which protected people against, quote, arbitrary despotism. So in your description of what these big social media companies are doing, would you say that this is an example of arbitrary despotism?
It's a feudal system. So yeah, I think 1215 is relevant. So you have the feudal lords that are completely unaccountable, right? It's not a democracy, right? Like Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg in particular, because he has full discretion over what happens on Facebook. Jack Dorsey less so. I think Jack Dorsey is sort of captive to his trust and safety team over there a little bit. But they're the feudal lords. And then below them, you have the dukes that, basically carry out policy and they decide who gets banned. And then below that, you basically have the serfs that toil on the plantation and own nothing, right? We don't own our data or our handles on social media. It's not understood as property, although it should be, of course. But you have the sharecroppers and the serfs that own nothing. Their value of their labor is harvested by the duke and by the feudal lord. And they're completely disempowered and they don't have the right to freely exit. So it's amazing that people tolerate this unbelievable regression in terms of political economy when the context is the online space where, nevertheless, our activities are commercial and so on. And yet in our political lives, we love and revere democracy, et cetera. But then where it is actually most relevant to us, we're completely ignorant about the fact that we're being harvested by these completely unaccountable, like feudal states with incredibly unclear legal systems and, very opaque, very arbitrary, no codification of the rules of the land. And it's amazing to me that anyone tolerates it, really.
The other thing we've seen, and really Trump brought this out, like he brought out the horrible side of the corporate Dems, let's call them, or the liberal left wing in America. And I would have counted myself as one of those up until what I've seen right now over the past few years, is that Silicon Valley has been forced to use essentially think tanks, financed, by the way, by all sorts of governments around the world, think tanks and mainstream media as sources of legitimate news. They get to determine if you, Nic Carter, are spreading disinformation by your opinion. And this comes into play with Bitcoin because we've seen they all agree, mostly the mainstream media, that Bitcoin is the dream is dead. They believe it's a bubble, it's a scam, or as Christine Lagarde would say, and she's an official that should be accepted as a truth teller according to the new metrics on the likes of Twitter and Facebook, that she says it's a reprehensible currency used to launder money. So, what about that sort of dichotomy of who gets to be the arbiter of truth?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the most offensive things about this awful setup we have is the epistemic privilege that these platforms wield. They really presume that they have some sort of special purchase on the science and facts, which was obviously, they became total parodies of themselves during COVID when there was a very fast moving information environment. New things were coming to light and some policy they'd had in place, you're not allowed to question the WHO. And then the WHO would reverse themselves a week later. So, we're expected to just have amnesia over the fact that it's extremely volatile, what is considered to be true. And we're still expected to embrace the truth as handed down by these platforms, which is comical in the extreme. And, just the very fact of their existing, these hard facts is, incredibly questionable to me. to me, they generally seem more like political opinions than facts, the things that the fact checkers provide for us. But yeah, in that hierarchy of the feudal hierarchy, you have another level, which I didn't describe, which is the people that, like the equivalent of Grima Wormtongue, in in Lord of the Rings, like whispering in the king's ear, saying, "Oh yeah, COVID isn't airborne in transmission," and just determining what the true facts are, and thus sanctioning any speech that's contrary to them. And of course, Bitcoiners, this is one advantage we have, because we are totally inoculated against, effectively the cathedral telling us what's true and what's not true. Because if you believed the press at any point, regarding Bitcoin in the last decade, you didn't buy it. And if you disbelieved the press, you bought it. So everybody in Bitcoin today is someone that at some point listened to or consulted the press and then rejected it. So I would say all Bitcoiners have actually been trained to reflexively reject opinions that are handed down from upon high, from the think tank, academia, media triumvirate. And there are people that are, Bitcoin selects for free thinkers, right? You kind of have to be a free thinker to be a Bitcoiner. So that's one kind of beauty of this, is that Bitcoiners as a demographic are, truly independent thinkers, and we're less exposed to this, completely authoritarian desire to determine what's true or not, even, outside the Bitcoin context. So we reflexively reject when people make these appeals to authority or appeals to academia or to, the science or whatever. So that's something that's really encouraging about Bitcoiners.
Right. Yeah, well said. Let me throw something at you. I just heard this today, and it's an interesting phrase, and I want to get your thoughts about it. It is an outgrowth or an extension or a follow-up on a phrase we've heard for a long time called disaster capitalism. Somebody came up with the idea to describe what's going on now as disaster liberalism. Your thoughts?
What's disaster capitalism? Can we define that first?
Sure. No, I will. Naomi Klein, I think, really made that term popular. So she was talking about how disasters typically encourage profiteers to swoop in and make wild capitalistic gains on areas that are in trouble. For example, we saw this when Greece collapsed, and Steve Forbes was there gobbling up everything in sight at disaster prices.
Hurricane Katrina.
Hurricane Katrina was also swooping in and capitalizing. On Wall Street, we used to call this vulture capitalism, where the private equity swoops in and gets great deals on the problem. Warren Buffett, famously after 2008 housing crisis, is now the biggest landlord in America because he was able to cut really sweetheart deals because the system was completely in distress. So this is the idea of disaster capitalism. I think with disaster liberalism, the idea is we've taken some of these liberal ideas, social justice warriors and these types of things, to a level now that is disastrous, some might say. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I see the point. Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in the last week is the fastest power grab on the part of the state and the sort of state extensions, the internet oligopolies, the fastest advancement of power and centralization that we've seen since 9/11. I think I can't think of another time when state power gained so much ground in such a short period of time. We have a militarization of the capital. Whether you think it's warranted or not, we have a full militarization in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you've seen any of those pictures. We have really aggressive curfews in D.C. More so than that, though, the events at the Capitol, as reprehensible as they were, are this amazing justification for this enormous power grab, obviously by the state. So we're going to see, new legislation about, domestic terrorism and all that surveillance apparatus that's been used for decades overseas is going to be turned inwards against its own citizens now. So we're going to see a Patriot Act 2.0. I'm absolutely certain of that. So we'll see all the things we expect that you would have expected from neocons. Now you'll see it from the liberal wing of the party. But also we've seen the advancement, the events of the Capitol were a justification for every major tech company to begin this policy of extreme political discretion who's allowed to use their services. So 5 years ago, it would have been unthinkable for Cloudflare to just unilaterally shut off denial of service protection to websites. Now you have a demand that they do that to all number of websites, not just, extremely reprehensible sites, like far wing extreme, but just, regular conservative sites that just, are falling in the politically disfavored camp. You have Amazon Web Services, like core internet infrastructure meant to be kind of a neutral service provider, cutting off service to all number of websites now. You have Salesforce, a CRM provider, politicizing who can use them. So you have this incredibly rapid sort of fracturing of who is allowed to use core internet services. And I mean, I wouldn't describe it as liberalism at all. I mean, it doesn't fit the definition of liberalism. If the classical definition of liberalism prides, the individual's sort of core unalienable rights, the rights to free speech expression, those aren't being upheld. So I mean, I don't know if liberalism is the word. It's done under the banner of progressivism and liberalism, but it's sort of a new sinister thing. It's like reminds me of the neoconservatives around the time of 9/11, justifying the invasion of Iraq and justifying the Patriot Act and the creation of the DHS. It seems like we're getting a total inversion of that now.
Right. It's not liberalism, but it's branded as liberalism.
Right.
Just like ExxonMobil will run ads saying what's showing the forest and the beautiful oceans and beautiful birds who's flying in the air and saying, Exxon job number one is, ecological purity, right? It's like they steal the images from Greenpeace to market Exxon's message. And it's propaganda. There's another word for that. It's called propaganda. Propaganda has a history that we're all aware of that goes back to the worst atrocities of the 1930s and the way that propaganda was used to sell atrocity. And what we're saying here, and what I'm hearing anyway, is that it's not liberalism. It's arbitrary despotism. And therefore, let me ask you this. Propaganda is a very powerful force. People can't fight it. It hits your subconscious and your unconscious mind. That's what makes it work. It's like subliminal advertising. How do you fight the propaganda? Because it seems like that anything you say to fight the propaganda, you're going to be immediately deplatformed. So are we in a lose-lose situation, Nic?
We're going to lose for the next couple of years, I think. The entrenchment of power and the concentration of power, at these internet oligopolies, and the fact that it's effectively an end around our constitutional rights. If you outsource state behavior to private entities, you get this loophole. That means that they can act completely unilaterally and censor speech at their discretion, which they now have a justification to do. And so, yes, I think all of the most sinister ways to control thought and expression on these platforms will be employed, from blocking link sharing to blocking the very mention of certain disfavored topics. You can do absolutely anything. You can be very creative with how you downrank certain conversation types and wall off certain demographics. And the fact that this is happening on the internet, and we have, like effectively frictionless communications technology, that also means that censorship is completely frictionless and can be done at scale. So that's a new thing. And previously we've had end arounds. You could literally print dissident literature, samizdat, and kind of hand it out on the street. Now, I guess you could still do that, but you can't print dissident tweets and distribute them on any of these platforms. They're acting in a highly coordinated way, and they can just completely vanish stories from the internet. I mean, the Hunter Biden story, it may have been completely without merit. I don't really have an opinion on that, but it was effectively vanished from the internet, and people basically didn't see it because all of these internet providers simultaneously said, no, this is not permissible speech. You can't discuss this news article in the New York Post or any of the subsequent articles. You're banned for discussing it. You're not allowed to share the link. Now, again, I don't really care about the contents of most of these stories. The fact that you can completely eliminate a community's ability to discuss them is incredibly sinister. So I do think that we are going to see the territory of freedom retreat even further over the next couple of years. And then the reactive impulse will be some pretty smart entrepreneurs are going to build some federated or decentralized technologies for discussion online. And those will gain a lot of territory, a lot of ground. And we'll see a very strong reaction away from these centralized legacy models like Facebook, et cetera, and towards newer decentralized models. But that's going to take time. And there don't appear to be that many platforms that are actually ready for this transition. So that's why I'm not that optimistic on sort of the near term.
Right. When you discussed the Hunter Biden story disappearing, that was really spooky to me. It was genuinely, I know the word gets used all the time, but Orwellian. And that's what Orwell used to describe totalitarianism. It's totalitarianism to memory hole stories like that. And that is really spooky that it's coming from the corporate Dems, those think tanks, and a certain sort of people who say they have your best intention in mind. And every totalitarian has had the best intention of the people in mind. But you also mentioned something in a previous answer where you said that Bitcoiners, are outside that cathedral. And for us here on Orange Pill podcast, we always talk about Bitcoin as offering up Renaissance 2.0. Now, the first Renaissance happened at a time just as the bubonic plague had wiped out half of Europe and the Inquisition had wiped out the others, that had survived that. The institution of the Vatican, which controlled all of Europe and thought of Europe and told you what was the truth, it was partly because, as you're describing with COVID and the WHO and the Federal Reserve, like saying that there will never be a collapse again, there will never be a financial crisis again. The institution at that time that everybody looked to for what was the official truth was the Vatican. And when the bubonic plague came, they didn't know how to explain it. They didn't know they didn't know how to tell the people why half the Europe just died. So the people lost faith in the institution that was supposedly in charge of the truth. And I think we're seeing that now. Bitcoiners are exposing all the lies, even if without intent. Like, look at as Biden, when it was clear that he was going to win Georgia, both seats, and then could pass whatever trillions of dollars he wanted and stimulus, Bitcoin went crazy. It went ballistic and parabolic. And it seems like, in a way, that this is setting up some sort of conflict between the modern Vatican, the imperial power of Washington, D.C., and their lies, because they have to say their lies are the truth. Of course, another Orwellian sort of thing. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, and Christine Lagarde said something fascinating. Actually, I thought it was the overlooked part of what she said about Bitcoin. She said something like Bitcoin is kind of an exit valve from the monetary system, right? And if a Bitcoiner said that, we'd all be like cheering her on, be like, yeah, definitely. But she was saying it in a way to suggest that it was a way to opt out of, the kind of ECB monetary doctrine, and that had to be clamped down. They had to close the valve. But, we all know it can't be closed. And so Bitcoin does this amazing thing where the price itself is a form of information signaling to the world at large that something terrible is happening, right? So the price is an index on just the awful behavior of central bankers, right? Among other things. So if you see Bitcoin skyrocketing, I'm seeing this percolate through the press. There was an article in Bloomberg recently describing Bitcoin and Tesla price as starting to freak out the Federal Reserve a little bit because it's exposing what they're doing. Because an alternative monetary asset keeps climbing, eventually people are going to wonder about that and wonder what it means. And, why is this alternative doing so good? What does that tell us about the existing system, right? So I really like that. And if you think back to when gold was banned, I think gold was banned because the U.S. government, gold was banned in the 30s. The U.S. government had to engage in monetary repression after World War II to basically print away all the debts and reduce the size of those enormous debts that existed in real terms by holding yields low and holding inflation very high or letting it run high. I think central bankers expect now they're going to have to do something similar, keep yields low and let inflation run high. The Fed's kind of signaling that to us. And so I think that's why we're talking about Bitcoin as an exit valve. We hear them discussing it as an exit valve. They want to close that valve so that people have to submit to the monetary repression the same way they closed the gold valve in the 30s. The difference is much harder to confiscate Bitcoin. So I think that's the bad news for the Christine Lagardes of the world. So I thought that I think there's a symmetry there.
Yeah, good. That's a good symmetry point for sure. That comment about it's an escape is like remarkable because every Bitcoiner in the world is like, right on. That's right. You've nailed it. You got it. And a lot of these legislators and policymakers and regulators end up saying stuff that is like a cream pie to the face. Like they don't realize how stupid they are in saying these things. It's obvious they haven't really studied the situation. And it gives me hope because I realize that, my God, we're so early on this. This price is going to go way up. I like the idea that Bitcoin price going up is like you're monetizing the disaster that's going on in the overall economy. And sometimes when Bitcoin goes down, I think it's because for a couple of weeks, people think, well, maybe it's not that bad. And then they realize, you know what, it is that bad. And they start buying Bitcoin again and it hits new all-time highs. And that's going to go on for quite some time. Quick note on the 1930s gold confiscation. So that didn't come after World War II, right? So it's back, I think, as a result of the excess of the 20s. We had the beginning of the Depression. And then this, prompted that response. But let me ask you about another kind of comparison to another country going through another political time. I've asked this to a couple of people, and it seems like you can make a comparison to the Mao's Cultural Revolution, where if people know the history of this, it seems. Oh, is that too much of a stretch in your view?
No, absolutely not. I think that is actually the most apt comparison to explain what's going on now. And it's very interesting that so many Americans, particularly younger Americans, are not familiar with the Cultural Revolution. They've never heard of it. There's not that many good history books on it. But I think it's, look, I'm not saying we're going to experience the same death toll and carnage that we went through in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, but it is so similar in so many ways. I mean, you have universities, you have students basically denouncing administrators and professors at universities and hounding them out. This has been happening over the last decade. And we were told it wasn't going to grow beyond the universities. Well, it did, because these same attitudes that were just described as being radical, kind of extreme leftist university views eventually percolated and made their way up into corporate America. And now they are expressed through HR and through platform decisions. So that is certainly happening. I think if you look at the fracture in American society, it's also very reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. You have kids denouncing their parents on social media. They'll post an incriminating Snapchat or TikTok and harvest all of the harvest all the goodwill from exposing their parents for having the wrong political opinion. So you literally have family members being turned against each other all the time. I mean, people constantly talk about, oh, I can't go to Thanksgiving because my uncle's a Trump supporter. I can't abide my family anymore. So we see this fracture in society based on this unbelievable polarization, and now it's crossed the realm of just academic fringe university stuff. It's crossed the realm from culture, and now it's being installed in the corporate context, which is maybe even more insidious and more dangerous. But yeah, I think the analogy is completely apt, and it feels chaotic because it is. It's just that we don't have that much violence on the streets yet, at least.
Right, kids ratting on their parents. When you said that, it reminded me of a scene from a film called Cabaret, which was in Weimar, Germany. And there's a scene where a member of the Hitler Youth is singing "Tomorrow Belongs to Us." And it's a long, extended scene. And it's chilling because you realize how that generation was propagandized and indoctrinated into something that was pure evil. Let me ask you a quick question. You know, I talked to American Hodl, who is another Bitcoiner, and he expressed to me an interesting thought. I'll get your view on it. First of all, I have to establish, are you a millennial?
Yeah, I think I'm just millennial. I'm not a Zoomer.
Okay.
I'm 28. So
He said that Bitcoin is essentially a millennial phenomenon and that Gen Z are just along for the ride. And he kind of dissed them and saying, you know what, they don't really know what's going on. Can you comment on this, Nic Carter?
Well, I mean, when I was at the same age that the Zoomers are today, I also didn't care about Bitcoin. So I can't fault them for not really being that interested in Bitcoin. I mean, your financial portfolio is like a grown-up thing. So when I was 21, I wasn't really that focused on, you know, my asset allocation. You don't have any assets when you're young. And I think the Zoomers actually have this kind of nihilism about them. I've kind of noticed they actually feel like somewhat hopeless, or they feel that the world is a little absurd. The millennials are depressed because they've been kind of frozen out of the ability to, you know, get on the corporate ladder and save, because all financial assets are too expensive. The Zoomers have just taken it to a level of absurdism where, you know, they sort of realize that their prospects are dim because of the way that society is configured. But you know, I don't see a lot of engagement with Bitcoin among them. I mean, they're more focused on becoming like a TikTok celebrity or something, which I think in of itself is telling, because if you have this stage of degeneration of the fiat regime, saving, you know, becomes less important. It becomes de-emphasized. Long-term planning becomes impossible, right? And everyone fixates on becoming an overnight success and get rich quick schemes. So I think that's why, you know, if you ask a Chinese youth, well, what do you want to do for a career? They might say, oh, you know, technical degree, become an engineer or something. Yes, an American youth, they'll say, I want to be an influencer and, you know, make a ton of money really quickly. And I think that doesn't just reflect the cultural attitudes. I think it reflects where we are from kind of a monetary perspective. If you feel your savings being debased, you're not going to want to plan for a long-term career. You're just going to try and, you know, become a celebrity or something. So I don't see that much engagement with Bitcoin for the Zoomers, but I guess that's our job, is to reach them.
Right. I do want to add that we do have quite a few Gen Z in our Orangefield podcast Telegram group. They mostly come in there and say, hey, my mom or my dad watches you and told us about Bitcoin, and that's why they're there. But, you know, in terms of, I want to kind of segue to another thing you tweeted. You've been on fire on Twitter lately, by the way. Your tweets are just like on fire. You tweeted that, quote, once you start thinking of Bitcoins as a continuous quantity like a liquid rather than discrete units like atoms, things start to make a lot more sense. Make sense of this for us.
Yeah, so for some reason on Bitcoin Twitter, we've been having a lot of metaphysical debates recently. That tweet was inspired because I'd had a discussion with Francis Coppola on the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Yeah.
And, you know, we had a long discussion on that show about whether Bitcoin is truly scarce because it's divisible. And the way I think it's easier to think of you get confused when you start trying to boil Bitcoin down to the smallest unit, down to the Satoshi, and you start wondering, well, maybe couldn't you just create more decimal places and infinitely, you know, maybe it's infinitely divisible. And I think it's a little confusing, especially because Bitcoin is this dematerialized, you know, digital thing. I think of it as a single quantity, which then gets divided up into different, you know, segments. And so, you know, UTXOs, to me, those are containers, and they contain sort of arbitrary quantities of Bitcoin. And, you know, I think this is a better analogy to think about it, because it's actually not a cash scheme where you have bills like DigiCash or any of those other eCash schemes where you had serialized kind of bills, right, in different denominations. You know, you'd have many fixed denomination bills and you'd have to sort of recirculate them. Like those were prior eCash schemes. part of Satoshi's genius was he just treated Bitcoin as this kind of continuous quantity, and you're just managing the transfer of different quantities of Bitcoin, and it sort of flows through the network, and the protocol makes sure that there's no additional Bitcoin being created. So it's a metaphysical debate, but I guess because Bitcoin is so hard to really reason about, I think it's important to sometimes, you rely on these analogies, basically.
Right. I tweeted something not too long ago where basically the idea was there is one Bitcoin.
Yeah.
There's just one.
I fully agree.
Right? There's just one.
I fully agree.
And then we go down the path of dividing it, but it's essentially there's only one. What about the statement that you can only create absolute scarcity once? I find this to be very profound, and I kind of intellectually work around it in my mind. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think the circumstances of Bitcoin's birth are unrepeatable. And I think if another competitor were to take over Bitcoin, then that competitor would face the same problem and recursively. So I think the social contract that we sort of implicitly agreed to is we're all going to treat this thing as if it's unique and scarce, and it became unique and scarce. And there's also historical contingencies, which mean that Bitcoin had amazing advantages. It could have gone much worse, the launch of Bitcoin. I think it went as well as conceivably possible. You had this almost 2-year period where it was worth basically nothing. And so it was kind of freely dispersed. And because it wasn't monetized from scratch, you didn't have all these like predatory funds come in and try and get all the Bitcoin, So like if you compare it to other times you've had to distribute things to communities from scratch, think about the privatization of the Soviet Union after it collapsed. You had these voucher programs that were distributed to citizens of what became Russia. And what happened was a lot of them sort of didn't really understand the value of the thing. And they sold them really cheaply to all these funds, and the oligarchs managed to get all the vouchers. So if you have a system where it's valuable from the start, there's going to be an extreme incentive for larger players to come up and acquire all of the units. But if it's valueless at the start, then it's the hobbyists that acquire it. So we went right to the precise, correct constituency who did the faucets, they distributed the coins. Laszlo had 80,000 coins. He got rid of them through his pizza transactions. You had all of this generosity, but it wasn't so difficult because Bitcoins were worthless. And this gave it a base of hobbyists and users, as opposed to, a handful of hedge funds. If Bitcoin had been monetized from the start, and we obviously see this with coin offerings today, the first buyers are all hedge funds. If it had been monetized from the start, it wouldn't have had that opportunity. And it wouldn't have been able to get this buy-in from this amazingly diverse kind of global community of users. So I think the circumstances are unique. And now that digital money exists as a concept, you can't repeat that. Because if you were to make a Bitcoin 2.0 and somehow Satoshi returned and said, hey, I've built a better Bitcoin, like I'm going to start now, that would, billions of dollars would immediately flow in from the largest funds in the world to try and get a privileged access to the system. So I hate it when people downplay the circumstances of Bitcoin's birth. They are totally unique and unrepeatable. Very, very special origin story, I think. One of the best kind of myths, but it's a true story. So it's amazing.
I think that's a great place to wrap this up because that is the most perfect summation of Bitcoin. And very few were around then. Max and I got involved in early 2011. And people always say, oh, I wish I were there back then. But it was a totally different thing. Bitcoin was a different thing. People were spending it wildly. Everybody thinks like they would be a multi-billionaire today. Have they been there then? With the knowledge that they have today, back then, like we thought it was it was magic internet money for real. And as you mentioned, like loads of people had faucets. Marty Malmi ran a faucet, gave away thousands of Bitcoin. Obviously, had he known where it was going to go, he wouldn't have done that. That was a stupid thing. But I love that as an ending. And I love that you also said about the price signal being very important with Bitcoin, because it does reveal the price of Bitcoin reveals a lot about the truth of the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
It doesn't just reveal the enthusiasm for Bitcoin. It reveals the degeneration of the dollar, generally. So there's, the numerator and the denominator to think about.
Yeah, right on. Well, I mean, this has been fantastic. It exceeded my expectation. I knew this was going to be good, but I actually was riveted. I learned a lot of stuff with this one. Thanks, Nic Carter, for coming on.
Thanks, Max and Stacy. Really appreciate it.
Right.
How do you like your new podcast position, the mic? I moved it a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, much better. Yeah, you've nailed it. It's got some extender thing and no shadows. We're getting out. We're really super pleased with it. So Nic Carter, super great interview. We've been following on Twitter for a while. Met him at that conference a couple of years ago. And actually opened my eyes to a few things there that I hadn't thought about. Really, really sharp.
He's really good. I think I'm going to call this episode "Bitcoin is the Exit Valve." I thought that was. I had missed that from Christine Lagarde, or as Pierre Rochard says that he's a French speaker, native French speaker, and he says that Americans mispronounce it. It's not Christine Lagarde, it's Christine Lagarde. So whatever, but. The fact that she said that is pretty amazing. And I think it's quite telling as well. I mean, she's very smart. She got away with helping Bernard Tapie. Like plunder the French state for, I think it was like 400 million.
Oui, très grand. Beaucoup d'argent.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are interesting times. I think, that interview with Nic Carter, you could be a bit worried. Because we are, it is right to be a little bit concerned about the arbitrary despotism that we see all around us. But I think Bitcoin is an exit valve. I think Christine Lagarde is right that this is an exit valve.
Wait. She'll always be Lagarde to me. I will not change my pronunciation of cette femme's nom. Cause moi, je crois qu'elle est despicable. Elle est complètement chien. Complètement. Mais, alors, nevertheless, this is going to be an ongoing thing. I'm going to actually start learning my French again. I want to be able to insult Christine Lagarde even with better French grammar than I am already. So this is my challenge for 2021. But getting back to Nic Carter and this whole business. So the despotism that is, random and arbitrary despotism, this is the point that he makes, which is really awesome, is basically this, what I take away from it, the idea that these companies are private companies, therefore they can do whatever they want. And that is at its foundation fallacious. It's on its foundation wrong. And it's anyone who believes and goes down that path is completely wrong. And this is you can't justify it in any way.
So again, the Orange Pill Podcast Telegram group is there for you at the moment. And that despotism is coming, and they're going to seek censorship in the, that social media space, but also in the monetary space as well. I think that's what Christine Lagarde is concerned about. She wants to shut off the exit valve, turn it off so you can't escape. They don't want any escape hatch for the population. We are also establishing, in conjunction with swanbitcoin.com/max. So if you go to swanbitcoin.com/max, you can start dollar cost averaging or smash buying into Bitcoin every time it dips. In a bull market, it's always a good time to smash buy. And we're going to come out with a newsletter with them. So if you go there to orangepilldailydose.com, orange pill, you know how to spell that because you're in the Telegram group watching this, or if you look at the YouTube channel, orange pill, dailydose.com. You could register there for the newsletter, which we will be start publishing soon every day. And that's also a good way to stay anti-fragile and, our freedom to assemble in this Orange Pill podcast universe where we can all chat to each other. Well, that's a way to have a website, your own RSS feed outside of Jack or Mark Zuckerberg's sort of feudal oligopoly.
Right. Remember, you don't have to believe what we're saying, not even a single word of it. just believe in Bitcoin. Because unlike any other movement in history, there is no leader with Bitcoin. You know, usually movements are decimated because the leader is taken out. You know, this is the first time in history that I'm aware of where the leader is, there's no leader. There's no leader, and you can't take out the leader. So I can say any goddamn thing I want to say, and you can't accuse me of betraying the movement because the movement has no leaders. I'm no more in this movement than you are. If you've got one Satoshi, we're in the same boat, buddy. We're in the same boat. We're in the same boat sailing to that orange sunshine. Out we go to a better tomorrow. It's orange. It's beautiful. It's bright. And it's time to say, adios, muchachos.